On this episode of the Warped Reality Paranormal Podcast, Ghost Joe and myself dive deep into the strange intersections of covert surveillance, invisible technologies, psychological warfare, and the hidden influence Hollywood projects across the globe with California State University professor and 32nd degree Scottish Rite Freemason Robert Guffey. Guffey's work sits right at the crossroads of the paranormal, the conspiratorial, and the culturally uncanny, and this conversation takes us deep into all three. Fair warning though, this episode contains discussions of psychological warfare, mind control, and covert ops. So if three black SUVs show up outside afterwards, tell Agent Jenkins that the thing we said about his wife was just a joke. But deep down, Ghost Joe meant it. Let's get started.
Do aliens exist and are they among us? Are weird creatures lurking in the darkness? Do evil entities hide in the shadows of your bedroom while you sleep? Join us as we explore all this and more on the Warped Reality Podcast.
So, Robert, can you define what exactly is a Freemason?
No.
Oh.
A Freemason is a member of a fraternal organization that either extends back in time to 1717 or it extends back to the beginnings of Atlantis and Lemuria, depending on who you're reading and who you choose to believe. But it is a esoteric fraternal organization with many offshoots.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And was integral in fomenting various revolutions like the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And there's a book by James H. Billington, if you're looking for a reliable source about these things. James H. Billington, who was the Librarian of Congress for many years, wrote a book called Fire in the Minds of Men. And it's all about this revolutionary period, that covers the French Revolution, the American Revolution. And in that book, he goes into documenting with scholarly research the influence of these kind of hermetic organizations on these revolutions in that time period. So, in fact, I just wrote an article that I'm kind of shopping around right now. It ties into the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so I try to parse out the truth and the falsehood and the conspiracy theories involving the beginnings of the United States of America. Some people say this was a Christian nation at base. All the founding fathers were Christians. Then there's other people who say, oh no, everyone who signed the Declaration of Independence was a Freemason. It was a Masonic experiment from the beginning. And of course, with most of these things, the truth is somewhere in between. And so I wrote this whole article that hopefully will be published to tie in with the 250th anniversary. And it goes into, how many people actually were Freemasons who signed the Declaration of Independence? Not all of them were Christians. Some of them were deists. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. In fact, he wrote his own version of the Bible. It's called Jefferson's Bible. They used to give it out to new members of Congress because basically Jefferson said, can I curse?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Jefferson basically said, to paraphrase, that you could pretty much just shit-can the whole Bible, but keep everything that Jesus said. And so he did his own version where he literally cut and pasted with a razor blade, cut up the Bible and then took out the passages that he preferred and then made his own like cut and paste re-edited version of the Bible. And it's now called Jefferson's Bible. And they would give it to new members of Congress all the way up until the 1950s when the anti-communist kind of hysteria and the Birchers and all that began to gain a lot of influence, and then they stopped handing it out. But so, some of the signers, the Declaration of Independence, some of them were deists, some of them, many of them were Christians, many of them were Freemasons. And so in the article, I kind of go into specific detail, like detailing, who was a Freemason, who was a deist, who was a Christian, and trying to dispel a lot of the myths that have accrued over time, over all these different allegations.
That's really interesting. So you don't just write articles, you write articles. I mean, this article, like even the one that we were talking about before was in New Dawn magazine, right? The one about the
yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's a hefty article, man. That's a read. I like it.
I was contacted by George Knapp, who said that he'd never heard of New Dawn magazine before this moment. He read the article and he subscribed. So I wrote the editor. I said, I just got you a subscription from George Knapp. So
that's awesome.
You're welcome. But he seemed impressed by the article.
I'm putting money on it right now, Robert. Joe has no idea who George Knapp is.
I've heard the name, sir. Okay. I've heard the name.
I give Joe a hard time every chance I get. So,
okay. Is the vibe of the podcast like one of these things where one guy knows everything and the other guy doesn't know anything about the topic? Is that
yes?
Well,
yes, it
is. I see. Or is this like a Mulder Scully thing? Is one guy a skeptic and the other guy's not?
No. We both kind of hit it, but we look at. How would you explain it, Joe? Really? I mean, you explain this better than I do.
I do? Oh.
Yeah. You just explained it last week to Dave.
Oh, well, no. Well, we're more realists. That's how I had said it last week. I'd love to believe in it all. And, to be honest, if aliens started coming down, like I'd be in my glory, man. I really want to see an alien or Bigfoot or any of that stuff, but I'm more of a realist, and that's why me and Ken get along so well, is because we're both the same way in that way, where we want it to be true. I think it's the coolest thing in the world, some of this stuff, but you also have to have some kind of a level head with it as well. You can't just say, oh, well, that's paranormal. That's definitely that. That's a ghost. So that's kind of, I know that's where I stand with it, as far as that.
Yeah, we're pretty much on the same level there. I mean, as far as the vibe of the show, I don't think it's one person knows more than the other, anything like that. We both we've done a couple of different things, but we're both kind of right down the middle. Joe is more ghosts. He's more on the ghost side. And I'm more everything else. Like, I'm tired of ghosts. I'm that guy. Like, everything else is more fun to me than ghosts,
Yeah, see, like, I like the ghost, paranormal, the haunting stuff, the demonic possession stuff. That's the stuff that like really like super interests me, like demonology stuff. But I'm getting into the conspiracy stuff too. I'm as much as I want to push that away and like kind of steer away from it, I do kind of get sucked into that as well.
It's interesting. I'm friends with Melinda Leslie, who is a self-professed alien abductee and on my lab, military abductee, and she also does hauntings, investigations into reported hauntings, and some people are like frustrated with her, like, why are you wasting your time with these hauntings when you should be sticking to the alien abduction research or the but sometimes it's hard to draw a borderline around these things. It
is.
Some of these topics kind of bleed together.
I believe they're all connected in one way or another.
Sure. And it's interesting how, if you go back and look at the UFO books of the 1950s, I once heard Linda Moulton Howe say during a lecture that she basically intimated that all the UFO writers of the 50s, that most of them were either hoaxes or or insane or misinformed, and I like Linda Moulton-Howe, but I would disagree with her in that point, in the sense that many of those books are interesting, even if it is misinformation or disinformation. It has its own historical value as a time capsule, showing you what were people thinking about this topic at that time. And also sometimes the books that were complete disinformation had a great deal of effect, on people's perception of the topic, more so than the books that were, reliable. So they're interesting to read in that sense as well. But some of the books that seemed the most ridiculous at the time, the most absurd, in retrospect, seemed to me to be the most interesting, or the ones that seem more prescient. For example, like Albert K. Bender's Flying Saucers and the Three Men was considered extremely ridiculous when it came out in 1960, because it did blur the lines. It was talking about ceremonial magic and UFOs and Men in Black and supposedly beings from the hollow earth and creatures that sound like demons, and even mass telepathy. All these things were kind of mixed together. But if you go back and look at that book now, it seems sort of more of the moment in a way, in the sense that it kind of prefigures the later ufologists like Jacques Vallée and John Keel, or someone like Orfeo Angelucci, The Secret of the Saucers. I once interviewed Paul Laffoley, the master painter, Paul Laffoley, who's passed away now. But I interviewed him back in 2004, and this was a guy who, knew Buckminster Fuller and hung out with him. He knew all these incredible people, and he said that when he was a young man in New York, listening to the Long John Nebel show, which is kind of like the prefigures Art Bell. Long John Nebel had a late night show that went on from, I think, midnight to like 5 a.m. in New York, 5 nights a week. And he would often interview people like Ivan T. Sanderson or Richard Shaver, or Ray Palmer. And Buckminster Fuller told me he'd stay up at night painting, listening to Nebel's show. And he said, he goes, the one guy I gave the benefit of the doubt to was Orfeo Angelucci, because he said he seemed so naive, and everything he was saying had this amazing mythological importance, but he didn't seem to be aware of any of it. And even Carl Jung, in his last book about flying saucers, which was published in, I think, 1959, he even devotes a whole chapter to Orfeo Angelucci, and even down to the extent of analyzing his name and how amazing it. At first, he even speculates, is this his real name? But we know now that yes, that was the name he was born with. Orfeo, as in Orpheus, the mythological figure that goes down into the underworld, and then Angelucci as an angel or of the angels. And mixing these two things together into this story about a guy who comes across a UFO and is contacted by these celestial beings. And I think you could make a movie out of Secret of the Saucers, Orfeo Angelucci's book. So I think it's interesting that these figures who were kind of on the fringe of ufology in the 50s, and of course the people who were the most hardcore rationalists or the more respectable UFO researchers of the 50s, did even want to consider the idea that there were living beings inside the flying saucers. They were only interested in the mechanical aspects of, like, how does this thing work, and so you always had that kind of that divide between the gearheads, the people who are just interested in the technology and how do we back engineer this technology, how do we replicate it, and then the people who are kind of more metaphysical, and those two things are often diametrically opposed, and yet they all kind of merge together in a weird yin yang relationship in ufology. And so it's very hard sometimes to draw a line around a particular book and say this book is about UFOs, but this book's about ghosts. Like in terms of Flying Saucers and the Three Men by Albert Bender, it's a demonology book. It's a book about magic. It's about a book about UFOs. Maybe it's a book about ghosts too. You know, who knows? Hard to categorize these things, but that's one aspect of the field that's always fascinated me because it is so difficult to pin down.
So what was the catalyst that really got you going? I want to get this out of the way first of all. You were a professor of English, right, at California State University?
Yes, I teach creative writing, composition, literature classes, etc.
I think that's important to put out there for people that because you speak very well and you know a lot about what you're speaking about, and I like that. Sometimes you have guests on that you got to kind of prompt, and I like that I don't have to prompt you. You just go. I like that. You also have written over 35 books, right?
Hollywood Haunts the World is my 12th book.
I was looking at your bio trying to decipher that.
Oh, if we include like articles and short stories, then it's probably over like 100 publications, you know, stretching back to like 1996, I guess, which is when I published my first article in Paranoia magazine. The first article I ever published. It was an article about subliminal advertising and surrealism. And it was published in 1996, Paranoia magazine.
So what was the catalyst that got you interested in the weird stuff?
Well, you know, I went to, in 1996, I attended the Clarion Writers Workshop, and that's a workshop that happens every summer in Seattle, Washington, and it happens for 6 weeks, and there's a different instructor for each week, and each instructor is a different professional writer, usually associated with science fiction, fantasy, or war. And the workshop's been going on since the late 60s. It was started by Robin Scott Wilson, who ex-CIA agent Robin Scott Wilson started Clarion in Pennsylvania. And then later Clarion's opened in Seattle and also in San Diego. So I went to Clarion, and one of the instructors was Jack Womack, New York writer Jack Womack, writer of many novels, but one of which, Random Acts of Senseless Violence, I highly recommend. Very prescient. It was published, I think, in 94, but if you compare it, it's happening in the near future. But if you compare it to our current situation, I think you'll be surprised. Jack Womack's one of the main reasons I went to Clarion, because I had read his books, and I could already tell he had an interest in these kinds of this kind of subject matter. Tesla plays a huge role in his novel Terraform, and his Richard Shaver plays a huge part in Elvisy, another novel that he wrote. And when I was there and I was talking to him, he was telling me that when he was growing up, or a lot of his peers in science fiction kind of derived their, quote, sense of wonder from having discovered Robert Heinlein or Arthur C. Clarke, people like this. But Jack Womack, he said he got that kind of that fix, that sense of wonder from discovering Charles Fort. Mm-hmm. He said in a like a drugstore spin rack when he was very young in Kentucky, where he was growing up. And I identify with that because I had a similar experience. My mom worked at a thrift store in downtown Torrance, which I just recently discovered that Norio Hayakawa, the notable Area 51 researcher, I recently discovered that Norio Hayakawa was living in Torrance at the same time I was, but I had no idea that this was the case. Also, Dave McGowan, who wrote Program to Kill, he also lived in Torrance until he passed away. And I had no idea. I didn't know that either until recently. It's very strange. But anyway, my mom was working at a thrift store called Thrift Village in downtown Torrance. And when I was about 12, she brought home a stack of books from the Danbury Press in England. And the books were edited by Colin Wilson and Uri Geller. And each volume had a different theme. They were kind of like, more esoteric versions of those Time Life books on the supernatural. I mean, they were the same size as those books. Each one was black and white, and on the back had a pentagram with a Baphomet head in it. One volume had a chapter about this guy named Charles Fort, who wrote books about frogs falling from the sky. And one of the books was called Low! Which I immediately loved that title. And I tried to find books by Fort, but this was like the early 90s, pre-internet. So I checked the library and no luck. No Fort books were in print at that time. And I didn't actually read Fort's books until I was 19. And they were even more magical when I discovered them than I could have imagined. And Fort had a completely unique writing style. I mean, I don't think there's any other writer on the planet who ever wrote quite like Charles Fort, not just in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of his prose style. And, he wrote about strange disappearances and UFOs before the term UFOs even existed. He invented the word teleportation. He had a sense of humor as well, which appealed to me. And he was kind of an erudite scholar, which appealed to me as well. And there's a biography of Fort called The Man Who Invented the Supernatural. And that title may be a bit of an exaggeration, but he certainly invented the way we think about the supernatural today.
Very true.
But then on the other hand, when I was a teenager, I started subscribing to the Skeptical Inquirer, which is a skeptics magazine, which is still around to this day. And these people seemed equally obsessed with the supernatural, but with the intent to tear it down. And in my early 20s, when I was an undergrad at CSU Long Beach, I discovered they had a complete set of the Skeptical Inquirer going all the way back to the very beginning in the 70s. And in the early days, that magazine was called the Zetetic, which is a Greek word for inquiring skeptic or something like that. But in the early days, that magazine actually had ufologists like Jacques Vallée writing articles for them, and they were far more open to genuinely studying claims of the supernatural or the paranormal, rather than just having a kind of knee-jerk reaction to every claim of the supernatural. And I think that magazine kind of devolved into a debunking organization as opposed to scientists interested in learning the truth. And but that kind of like healthy skepticism kind of infected me early on, and I read books by James Randi and Joe Nickell, while at the same time reading books by Stan Friedman, the ufologist.
Yeah.
By the way, I only recently learned that there's a Stan Friedman museum.
Really?
Up in I think in New Jersey, I think.
Huh.
I'll have to check that out.
Somewhere on the East Coast, I think there's a Stan Friedman museum. Yeah, I need to go to that. But Stan Friedman wrote Crash of Corona and similar books. So I've always tried to maintain some amount of skepticism when dealing with unusual claims. John Keel he said, "Belief is the enemy." In the Mothman prophecies.
Yep.
And when you start believing something for no reason, you're on the path of no return. And, I think we've all known people who are interested in this kind of stuff have all known people who kind of went down, the rabbit hole and never came back again.
Yeah.
So I think it is important to, it's almost like I remember hearing or reading about Israel Regardie, who was, very ceremonial magician who studied under Aleister Crowley. And he suggested that anyone who was interested in ceremonial magic should have some grounding in psychology, like take a psychology class or something before you get into actually practicing ceremonial magic, because you can easily just slide off, down the rabbit hole. And I once interviewed Stephen Heller, who was the Gnostic bishop in Los Angeles. And he said at the time, unfortunately, the people were kind of mentally unbalanced. They're the ones who seem to run to these kinds of topics like a duck to water. And so that, and so I would put ceremonial magic, the paranormal, conspiracy theories, psychedelics, all this in the same category, where, you should have some grounding in psychology before you even begin to like delve into it. You shouldn't be, I wrote a whole book, Operation Mindfuck, which was all about I started writing that because of a guy I knew who got super into QAnon and went down the rabbit hole. And, we all saw where that went on January 6th of 2021. So, whether it's ceremonial magic or psychedelics or the paranormal, you could easily just slide off the edge.
I think you can do that with so many things. There's so many things. Like, that's so true that's true for religion. That's true for so many things. I mean, you always got to walk right down the middle. My grandfather told me when I was young, there's 3 lanes in life, right? Stay in the middle lane and watch the other 2 assholes wreck into each other. That way, you know what's going on all around you.
I think that's very wise. Yes, absolutely.
By the way, can I just say that I think that book title is probably the best book title I've ever heard.
Which one?
Operation Mindfuck.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
That's the one. That's a great title.
Well,
that's a great title.
I of course I appropriated that from the Discordians, Robert Anton Wilson and Carrie Thornley, because they had their own Operation Mindfuck back in the 60s, which was kind of doing hoaxes and performative tricks to kind of upset the establishment at that time. And so I go into the book about how a QAnon is kind of like the far right wing version of that. And in a way, the Discordians, they ripped off Operation Mindfuck from like the John Birch Society, who are doing their own versions of that back in the 50s. So this kind of operation seems to be like a pendulum swinging back and forth on the political spectrum.
Yeah. So I want to jump into. Go ahead, Joe.
No. Well, I was actually just gonna say one thing, because you had mentioned the term mind control, right? When you say mind control, like, everybody has this one view of, basically like this evil hypnotist type thing going on. Like, what exactly is mind control, in your mind?
Did I mention mind control? I actually don't remember.
You mentioned that term. Yeah, you mentioned the term.
Well, of course, what's interesting is that if you go back to before, say, when MK Ultra was actually declassified in the early 70s, when Richard Helms, who was the head of the CIA at the time, started, shredding all the documents, right? And they burned or shredded or disappeared most of the documents relating to this very real classified project. Before that, in the 60s, you can see the term mind control being used in a very different way, like Silva mind control, or, like New Age programs from the 60s that were meant to help people control their own mind. So it was meant as more as like a positive term, mind control. You're controlling your own mind, controlling your own subconscious. But of course, that's not the way the scientists who were engaged in MK Ultra meant it. They wanted to control your mind, and literally, like remotely control it. I mean, that's why Dr. Jose Delgado who was the Yale scientist from Spain who came to America, and he wrote the book Physical Control of the Mind, which is all about cracking open the skulls of primates and bulls and controlling them from afar by remote control. But these experiments were also done on, mental patients and, people in prisons and children. And that kind of mind control, very different from like Silva mind control. So Walter Bohr, who I was friends with, we even collaborated on a screenplay together. Walter Bohr, he founded the East Village Other, which was one of the major influential alternative newspapers in New York in the 1960s. He published early Robert Crumb and early Charles Bukowski and Ishmael Reed's first novel in the East Village Other. Walter Bohr, after he left the East Village Other, he wrote a book called Operation Mind Control in the 1970s. And that was the first major book about MK Ultra, because he wrote it only a few years after this revelation about MK Ultra. And the reason he wrote it was because in the book, he says it was a friend of his, a childhood friend, came back from Vietnam. He told me it was actually his cousin, and he was trying to kind of, protect his identity. But his cousin came back from Vietnam with what he called were cardboard memories that he had been used as he had been programmed as a mind controlled courier and assassin. And they had let him loose with these, quote, cardboard memories. He could remember things from his past, but only in the form of like snapshots. He had no emotional connection to them in any way. And Bohr was extremely distressed by this, so he started investigating, and it tied into the recent revelations in regard to MK Ultra. And so he started looking into Louis Jolyon West and Sidney Gottlieb and Jose Delgado and all these different scientists. And in fact, there's a recent book by Tom O'Neill called Chaos that's all about MK Ultra overlapping with the Charles Manson murders, which I actually recommend. I mean, it's not a perfect book, but it's well worth reading. So when I use the term mind control, I'm using it in the way that the government used it in their documents, and I'm using it the way Walter Bohr used it in his book Operation Mind Control.
It kind of reminded me, the beginning of that story you were saying there kind of reminded me of Chameleo a little bit, and how that all went down.
Yes. I think that's what's... first of all, this is interesting because I mentioned Jose Delgado. I didn't know when I wrote Chameleo, I wasn't aware that, and I only learned this when I read his obituary in the newspaper. Jose Delgado, when he died, in the obituary, it said that he had been living in San Diego. And I suddenly realized, and then I looked into, so when did he move there? Because he had moved after MK Ultra became declassified. Delgado skipped out of the country and went back to Spain and stayed there until he moved back to San Diego. And later I discovered that he moved back in 2000, I think the end of 2003, the beginning of 2004. That's exactly the time that the harassment, that Damien's harassment had hit its peak, so much so that that's when my friend Damien fled Pacific Beach, San Diego, and got into his black van and took off. But I thought that's an incredible coincidence that Jose Delgado shows up back in America in San Diego at the same time that this is going on with Damien. I imagine someone making a phone call like, we have a really difficult case here, Jose. This guy's just not going down. I think you'll be fascinated by this guy. Can you want to make the trip over here? He's like, okay, yeah, sure. So I didn't mention that in Chameleo because I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I was quite amazed when I discovered that.
Listen, I've read God, how many? I read 200 some books last year. I'm a nerd. I know. My parents were librarians, so
Definitely.
don't hold it against me. But when I tell you, Robert, that Chameleo was one of the most fascinating books I've ever read, I'm not lying to you. I could not put the damn book down. I literally, from start to finish, I was in it. I read that thing in one night, and I don't hardly ever do that. It was incredible. It was an incredible book, man. And the story in that book is just, listen, everybody that asks me, what should I read next? This one. You got to read Chameleo, man. Got to read it because telling you, man, that should be a movie. That should be a movie.
Well, thank you. It's a very good sign that you read it in one night. Because I remember similar experiences that I've had in that regard. I mean, I remember, I was at El Camino Community College in Torrance in my early 90s and in the early 90s. And there was one night when I was supposed to be studying for a biology test, and I absolutely did not want to be doing this. I remember the teacher's name, Dr. Hans Birch was his name. And then if you wrote on the paper, Mr. Birch, he'd cross out Mr. and in red, put in Doctor. And one day I looked up I pulled out the phone book because he had mentioned that he lived in Hermosa Beach. So I looked him up in the phone book and I found his phone number and I called him and he answered the phone, Dr. Birch speaking. And I hung up. I thought, that's all I need to know about this guy. He answered the phone, Dr. Birch. Anyway, I was supposed to be studying for this biology test and I got into the library and I checked out The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick and The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson. And I thought, before I start studying for this biology test, I'm just going to read the first few chapters of The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick. I ended up reading the whole book all the way through, finished it probably around 10 o'clock at night. And I thought, well, I guess I better start studying for this biology test tomorrow morning. But before that, I think I'll just read chapter 1 of this Jim Thompson book. And this was the first Jim Thompson book I'd ever read. It was in the Black Lizard trade paperback edition with these wonderful noirish photographic covers. And I started reading Killer Inside Me, and I read chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3. I read the whole book, finished that one like 3 hours later or something. So I read the Phil Dick book, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and The Killer Inside Me in a row. And by the end of it, and if anyone's familiar with Jim Thompson or Phil Dick, having read those two particular books in a row was making my brain pulsate.
Yeah, I bet.
And I never did study for the biology test. And I think I got like a C- on it.
Oh, no.
But that was fine. That was well worth it. So to hear from you that you read Chameleo in one setting is a huge compliment. And I wrote it. The actual act of writing it went very quickly. I mean, I think I wrote it in 2 months in the summer of 2010, maybe. And though I guess you could say that I've been working on it for a long time, but not knowing it, because I never really had an intention of writing a book about that topic. Because as I mentioned in the book, I was trying for a long time not to think about it. And later I was rereading John Keel, and I was amazed to discover that the amount of time that passed between 1967, when the whole Mothman Prophecy thing happened to Keel, and then him sitting down and writing about it, was about the same amount of time that elapsed between, when it all started with Damien in 2003, and then me like sitting down and actually writing it, because I just didn't really want to think about it.
Well, yeah, you kind of became a part of it, and I'm sure that was a wild ride for you.
Well, it was very disturbing because when In fact, there's been some recent developments. I guess I should mention that Chameleo has just been published in its first foreign translation.
Oh, nice.
In fact, this is the first time any of my books have been published in a foreign translation. But Yankee Books in Spain published a Spanish edition of Chameleo,
That's really cool.
and it came out just a couple. So there are people in Spain who are discovering Chameleo for the first time, and it was interesting. I got some emails from the translator, and the translator had some questions for me. It was like, what does this mean? What did you mean when you said this? And he commented to me, because I imagine, the job of a translator must at times be a tedious task,
Yeah.
depending on what the book is. He said this was absolutely like riveting experience translating this particular book. And at one point he asked me, he goes, "You mentioned this novel that you wrote, The Goblin Hordes of Pacific Beach." Because I mentioned in there that before Damien and I met Richard, I wrote a novel, because I didn't know how to write about this in terms of nonfiction, because at the time we hadn't met Richard yet. So what could you say? I have a friend who says these crazy things are happening to him. I mean, that's the story,
Yeah.
and that's not really enough to write anything, and I wrote this. It started out as a story, and then it became a novel, The Goblin Hordes of Pacific Beach. And it's kind of like a fictional version of the same events. And when I met Richard, I just pushed that aside. Like, I didn't even really think about it too much afterwards. But the translator said, "Well, what happened in that book?" And I said, I go, "I haven't looked at it in years." And he said, "Oh, you should, I'd be really curious to read it. You should pull it out and look at it again." So because of his encouragement, I pulled it out and I reread it, and I was fascinated by how different it is. Because in my mind, I'd just been thinking that it was overshadowed or just not necessary anymore because I wrote Chameleo, but it's actually quite different. And what's interesting about it is that the tone of the narrative is that you don't really know if this character's crazy or not, because that was kind of like the mindset I was in. I was kind of like still, it was like maybe about 15% of my brain thinking maybe Damien's going crazy. And then, of course, when I met Richard, I mean, that last shred of doubt, disappeared.
Sure.
I've actually been thinking of, I kind of rewrote it slightly, but I tried to keep it as much as possible, like how I originally wrote it. I might actually, start shopping that around, because it is actually quite interesting. It's almost like the relationship between, Phil Dix wrote Valis. Before Valis, he wrote a book called Radio Free Albemuth, which was kind of like his revving up to write Valis, and it was published posthumously. But if you read the two books, they're actually quite different, but you can see how one leads to the other. So, it might be interesting putting Chameleo and The Goblin Hordes of Pacific Beach like side by side aside as kind of like bookends. So I might publish that at some point.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I would like to read that.
I think it would be interesting. Yeah.
My favorite part of Chameleo was the part when Damien was in Kansas and called you, and it was actually the guys that he had. His car broke down, right? His van,
Right.
And it was like the farmer guys. And when I read that at first, I'm like, okay, where's this going? Is this going to be a Pulp Fiction moment? Where you remember the whole pawn shop scene in Pulp Fiction? I'm like, oh no, is this going to be like a Pulp Fiction scene or what's going on? And then I was really relieved that it wasn't. So,
so was I.
I bet.
That was incredible because I have a vivid memory of the, I was sitting there writing something or getting something ready for school the next day, and the phone rings, and it was like 10 o'clock at night or something. And I picked it up, and And it's just this guy with this kind of like Southern accent. And he's like, "You Robert Guffey?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then he goes, "You know a guy named Damien?" And instantly I was like, "What now?"
Yeah. Oh shit.
What? Where are we now? And then that's when he proceeds to tell me that he and his friend Zeke or whatever the hell it was had picked up Damien off the side of the road because his van broke down, and then they brought him back to their house in the middle of nowhere. And the guy's like, "This guy's saying that there's all these invisible midgets running around chasing him, and there's little like floating eyes, surveilling him and recording him, and saying is this, what the hell? Is this true?" And I was like, "Yes, actually, that is all true." And I then proceeded to tell him like an encapsulated version of everything that had happened to Damien up to that point. And then as I'm talking to them, because up to this point, Damien had been telling me how these little drones, even though this is before drones were commercially available and were really just kind of speculative fiction at this point, because we're talking early 2004, and you couldn't just like walk in and buy a drone at that point. But what he was describing, what he said, like these little like discs were floating around and following him. And then as I'm talking to this guy, his friend Zeke or whatever is like, "Get over here, come over to the window. There's a little flying saucer outside." And then the guy is on the phone describing to me as they part the curtains that there's a little flying saucer, like glowing thing floating outside the house that had followed them from the highway. And then at that point, like they're freaking out. At that point, they totally believed what I was saying, because I was scared that I got the sense that they thought that Damien was like possessed by demons, and they were going to like exorcise them out of him or something.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
it was going into a weird dark area. But after they saw the drone, wherever the hell it was, I was able to convince them to give him gas and help him get on the way back on the road. And then he ended up in Winona, Kansas, soon after that, where there's like if you can look it up, the population of Winona, Kansas, it's like 112 people or something. And so the surveillance that was happening kind of died down at that point, because I don't think you can like gang stalk someone when there's 112 people in the town,
Right.
particularly when all 112 people own guns.
Right. That story, that whole story, that book is incredible, man. And, it's a wild ride. It really is a wild ride. And I love how in the beginning you were like, okay, Damien. All right. Okay. And then as it progresses, you start thinking you're going crazy. You know what I mean? I just love that progression in the book.
And of course, that's in a way, it kind of parallels like certain UFO incidents where one person will see a UFO and then it kind of like sticks to them like a poltergeist or something. And then like suddenly the other person's having UFO experiences, or
Sure.
the hitchhiker effect, kind of thing. And should we assume that should I give like a elevator pitch version of
Yeah, let's
Chameleo
do it,
just
man,
really
because
quickly? So
it's a fresh audience.
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Okay, so I'll tell an abbreviated version. It's kind of hard to do that, but I'll try. So in 2003, my friend Damien, who in the book I call Dion, because I changed the names of everyone in the book unless they were like public figures. I've known Damien since my 16th birthday. That's when I met him. And in 2003, it was the summer, he begins telling me that he believes he's a victim of surveillance and harassment. He's living in San Diego at the time. His house is kind of a party house in the Pacific Beach area. He lets this kid he had just met crash on his couch. Damien doesn't know that this kid had just gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton. the nearby Marine base, which was just in the headlines because our friend J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth went there to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Marines. And this kid had stolen a 9mm gun, taken off the body of a dead Iraqi general, a DoD laptop computer, over 24 night vision goggles, and an entire truck. He took all this with him when he went AWOL from Camp Pendleton. So some of this stuff was at Damien's apartment, some of it wasn't. But one night, the NCIS, and which, by the way, this is before like the NCIS had their own TV show.
Nobody watches that
this
show
is,
anyway.
I watched that.
Of course
show.
you did, Joe. It's so.
I liked the girl on roller skates.
The
That was the one
one-liners.
with the girl on roller skates, right? I like the girl on roller skates. Okay, Abby. That was NCIS.
I saw one episode of NCIS. It had Ray Wise in it. You know, Leland Palmer from Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
I think he was a politician and his son had killed somebody, or I don't remember much about it. But they do try to make the NCIS, you know, like they're the heroes, but they're not the heroes in this particular story. The NCIS and the San Diego Police Department, they show up at Damien's apartment and they arrest the kid and Damien because they decided that Damien must be involved in the plot to sell the stolen equipment to Al Qaeda or some foreign terrorist organization. And at this point, it's, of course, the funny thing, it's the U.S. government actually engaging in the conspiracy theory at this point. They have created a conspiracy theory that Damien and this guy are engaged in some international conspiracy to sell this equipment. And so they're accusing Damien of being involved in this criminal organization that doesn't exist, or if it does exist, that Damien's not a part of it. The kid just ended up on his couch, you know, just through pure happenstance. So it's all very Kafkaesque. And Damien keeps telling the arresting officer, who I call Lita Johnson, though that wasn't her real name. She was a special agent for NCIS. He keeps telling her he doesn't know anything about this. They don't believe him. So they give him the Abu Ghraib treatment for an entire week. And then eventually they let him go, and he calls me and he tells me this weird story. And we both think, oh, well, you know, that's weird, but that's probably the end of it. They wised up and they figured out that he doesn't know anything. He called me back several days later to tell me he's being followed, surveilled, harassed in very unusual ways. It almost sounds unbelievable. And he's telling me that like a whole parade of jarhead looking dudes are following him around San Diego and being very blatant about it. It's not like they're being surreptitious. It's as if they wanted him, you know, to see them. And I go, look, Damien, I go, maybe like take some photographs, you know, of the cars or these people, or like send me something that's like tangible. And he sends me photographs and a list of the license plate numbers of these vehicles that he claims have been following him around. And so I happen, and the list is in the book, I happen to have known a guy who worked for the DMV up in Washington State. And so I sent him the list of license plate numbers, and he runs it through the system, and he says they're all officially like non-existent, which doesn't make any sense because I knew they existed. And if it was just like some random neighbors who lived in the neighborhood and Damien was being paranoid and he thought they were following him, still it would link to actual vehicles that exist.
Sure. So
that kind of told me, that was the first indication. Oh, Damien's not going crazy. There's actually something to this, because the only reason they wouldn't exist in the system is that they were government vehicles. I mean, that's the only thing I could think of. So I actually spoke to the NCIS agent in charge of his case just to verify that this was actually occurring in objective reality outside of Damien's imagination. And the NCIS agent said very weird, suspicious things that indicated she was the one lying to me, not Damien. And that the transcript of that conversation is in the book. Uh, and at this point, Damien becomes a victim of electronic harassment, electronic warfare, non-lethal weapons that in fact are very lethal, though at a slow pace sometimes. And he's basically being used as, I would say, as a guinea pig. And the effects were not dissimilar to the Havana syndrome that 60 Minutes has done several reports about.
Yep.
So at this goes on for many months. He's losing weight. He is urinating blood. There's a constant metallic taste in his mouth. These are all side effects of electromagnetic poisoning. And I knew that. I knew that because I knew Walter Boart and I had read Operation Mind Control. So, he claims there are people breaking into his house who he cannot see. And they're touching him, pushing him over, interacting with him physically, but he cannot see them. And that sounds completely outrageous, except that several years later, in 2006, after an incredible series of coincidences and synchronicities, Damien and I meet the scientist named Richard Schonger, because soon after Damien made it to Winona, Kansas, after the encounter with the two good old boys on the side of the road, he kind of, for some reason, the surveillance, the harassment kind of stopped for a little bit. Now, I don't know if that's because it was such a small town and it's hard to surveil and harass someone in a small town, or if they just decided to pull back a bit or what. I have no idea. But he was actually able to get his brain in order. And at one point, he went on the internet and he was trying to find anything that looked like the technology that he had seen, this kind of invisibility technology. And he saw a story about Professor Tashi in Japan who had created this invisibility cloak. And they keep pulling this out. Like every 5 years, there'll be a new story about somebody's invented a new invisibility device. It's the Harry Potter cloak. And it's always the same thing over and over again. I just recently saw another story about this. And it's always just, it makes them invisible. It cloaks them from one angle, which is not what Damien was experiencing back in 2003. Whatever it was more sophisticated because it was 360 degrees, so Damien comes across this website, Chameleo.net, and he goes, "Oh, you should take a look at this." So I go over to the website and I look at it, and it's this guy, Richard Schonger. And what surprises me is that he says that he has invented this technology that he called optical camouflage technology, that he had, years of top secret experience working in the DOD, going back to the 50s, and that he was also a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason in Long Beach, California. Now, I am a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason in Long Beach, California. So if something occurs to me, I must know this guy. I must have met him at some point in the past. And so I email him and I tell him, "Look, I'm a writer. I've written for all, these various magazines, New Dawn magazine and Fortean Times and et cetera. And I'd like to interview you about your technology." And I think, if I hadn't been, I told him we're in the same lodge. If I had not been in the same lodge, I don't know if he would have talked to me or talked to me quite as openly as he eventually did. But he said, "Oh, great. Let's meet at the lodge next Saturday." So I call Damien and I go, "Look, the guy wants to meet me this Saturday, Saturday morning." And so Damien goes, I'm putting everything into the van. I'm just going to come to Long Beach. So he had been in Winona, Kansas for about like 3 months at this point. And he'd gotten into some kind of insane dispute with his landlord. And so I remember right before he left, he grabbed a bunch of wet cement and just poured it down the sink in the kitchen and in the bathtub. And then he got into his van. He took off. He went to the Long Beach, and he's staying in his van outside my apartment building. And we go and meet Richard on this Saturday morning. And after the rituals, I meet Richard, and I suddenly realized that I had seen him before. I hadn't met him face to face, but I had seen him performing in the rituals. He had a very distinct voice, kind of Midwestern drawl. And I thought, oh yes, I have been in the same room with this guy before. We formally introduce ourselves. I take Richard outside where Damien's waiting in the van. And I say, this is my friend Damien. He's going to join me in the interview. And Richard says, okay. We went out to lunch at George's Greek Cafe on Pine Avenue in downtown Long Beach. And then afterwards, we went to the CSU Long Beach campus. I took Richard to my office at the time. And I told Damien, I go, don't say anything until don't interrupt the interview. Don't say anything about your experiences until like the proper time. Like we don't want to like influence him or anything. Cause I quite frankly didn't think that this was going to tie in with Damien's experiences at all. I thought the chances of that were really low. And instead we sit down, and before I can even ask him about any of this directly, he just starts throwing out he's talking about how his technology, he had met with the Navy many years before. He had met with a company called SAIC, which was a company that was based in San Diego within walking distance of Damien's apartment. SAIC had expressed interest, the Navy had expressed interest, and then they would just kind of vacuum up the information that he had. They would dangle some promises in front of him, and then they just kind of disappeared. And I even have, since Richard, by the way, passed away in December of 2021. And since then, I have like documents. I have a letter from the Navy to him talking about this technology. I mean, there's documentation, emails back and forth between SAIC and the Navy. So this wasn't like Richard's imagination or something. And I hadn't mentioned before that some of the things that Damien had experienced was not just the visibility technology, but he had actually seen, sometimes he would come home and the apartment would seem to be smaller than it was previously. Or conversely, it would seem to be much larger inside than it had been, like Doctor Who's TARDIS. And Damien was the only one who experienced this. You have friends come over and say, Damien, is your apartment growing? Or like one day he looked out the window and the view of the parking lot of Vaughn's wasn't there anymore. Now it was like some weird Boris Vallejo painting with 3 moons in the sky. And Damien's like, what the hell is this? And he opens the door, and it's just the parking lot and the Vaughn's, closes the door and look out the window. It's this weird, surreal alien landscape. Things like that would happen. Or he was laying in bed one night and a silhouette of a hand appeared on the wall with a gun in it. It's like the silhouette of a hand with a gun in the hand, and the gun would tilt down toward Damien's head and then tilt up again. Things like that would happen. So now he just completely unbidden starts telling us about how you could use this technology. And he says, well, you could use it in the battlefield. You could use it as psychological warfare. You can make someone think he's a tree is an elephant. You can make an elephant look like a tree. You can make someone's house look like it's bigger on the inside than on the outside. Or you could do the opposite. He goes, in fact, that's in the patent. Psychological warfare aspects are in the patent. He goes, if you had somebody like Fidel Castro, you could make Fidel Castro think he was going insane. And just on and on, like every single point, but these strange, odd details that we had not mentioned, Richard brought up himself. And it took great restraint for me and Damien not to suddenly turn to each other at each of these points, and say, Richard, we have a story to tell you. We just let him talk, and the whole transcript's in the book. And at one point I said to Richard, okay, Damien has a story to tell you. And I remember Richard, the attitude of Richard's face, the look on his face was like he kind of tensed up a bit, like maybe he thought we were going to sandbag him with something. But instead, Damien starts telling him everything that had happened to him. And at first, Richard looked a little skeptical, like this is a really weird story. I think it had helped that we had gone to lunch beforehand and he had gotten to know Damien a little bit. It wasn't just like totally out of the blue. So me and Damien are telling him the story. And when there was one point early on when Damien had first started encountering these optically camouflaged people in his house, that he had opened the mirror in the medicine cabinet in his bathroom. And as he was opening it, as the mirror was in motion, he was able to see the person behind him, but only when it was in motion. And sometimes he would occasionally see them as these kind of like dots in the air, almost like auras. When people have intense migraines, they see auras in the air. It almost looked like that, he said. He mentions this, and at that point, Richard like leans forward and he says, when Damien tells him about the mirror and seeing it briefly while the mirror was in motion, Richard goes, that's because the suit, the mirror is not cloaked, the suit is, and so the mirror was able to pick it up while it was moving. And Richard seemed to understand like why that was. And then when Damien mentioned seeing the auras, Richard like leaned all the way forward. He goes, that's exactly what it looks like when the technology is not working right. They haven't quite figured it out yet. And at that, and he had already mentioned that he was suing the U.S. military for stealing his technology because he already suspected that they had stolen it. So now this was just, further evidence of that. But of course, it's almost impossible to sue the U.S. military. And so at that point, and there are other details that convinced Richard that Damien was telling the truth. So then soon after that, I remember thinking, okay, now that Damien has this confirmation that this is actually happening, it'll probably make him feel better. But it actually had the exact opposite effect, because I think Damien was holding on to some small strand of hope that he was going crazy. Because if he was going crazy, you could just take medicine for that and then everything's fine again. If he's not crazy, it's not an easy fix. And so soon after that, I visited Dr. Lev Berger, well-respected physicist, who had become Richard's partner in Project Chameleo. That's what they called it. An attempt to make soldiers invisible in the battlefield. And Dr. Berger, eminent physicist, when I went to his house in Hemet, in the middle of no man's land in Hemet, California, he had framed photographs of him shaking hands with Ronald Reagan. And then another photo of him with like Richard Nixon. I mean, he's a well-respected physicist. Dr. Berger passed away.
Hey guys, stay tuned next week for the remainder of our interview with Robert Guffey.
Thank you for listening to the Warped Reality Paranormal Podcast, and thank you to all of our guests and contributors that help make this show possible. For more information on the show, to listen to every episode, read paranormal news, or to submit your paranormal experience, check out warpedrealityparanormal.com. You could also email me at ghostjoeny@gmail.com. The Warped Reality Paranormal Podcast, uncovering the unseen.